Hey, welcome to Comedy Mentor Podcast. I'm here with Tracey Carnazzo, pro podcaster who hosts shows like Teen Mom Trash Talk and 90 Day Fiancé Trash Talk. She's going to answer some questions about how to get started in podcasting or like how to get further along and talk a bit about what she does. How are you doing, Tracey?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm pumped to talk to you about this.
Yeah, thanks so much for doing it. How did you get into podcasting?
Well, I think that, us being stand-up comics, everyone has a podcast. And I started podcasting probably around like 6 years ago. I was actually the co-host of a podcast called The Week in Sex with Alan Fuchs, who's a comedian that we all work with often. And it was a lot of fun. And I had such a great time with him. And I was like, I think that I want to do this. And I wanted to talk about Teen Mom because, who doesn't want to talk about Teen Mom? So I recruited my best friend, Noelle Winters-Herzog, and I just created some podcasts and we just started playing around, and we didn't think that anyone would listen, and they ended up listening.
And did you have any experience editing audio stuff before you got started, or?
I literally did not know what to do. So I started the podcast with Alan. I started co-hosting. He already had the podcast and he did everything. He hired an editor. So I had no clue what went on the back end. And then I started co-hosting a podcast with Justin Silver called Funny for Fido. And then from there, we started a podcast called Neurotica, and Justin did all of the work. So I really didn't think that I was even capable of doing the work. I had done very, very minimal audio editing in a media job that I was at. I worked for an internet radio kind of company that did advertising, but I didn't know how to do any kind of podcast things. I didn't even understand how to get a podcast onto iTunes because I had never had to do that before. Every time I hosted a podcast, it was with someone else that was doing all of that. So Justin actually taught me very simply how to edit in GarageBand. And I reached out to other podcasters, constantly asking them about equipment recommendations. And I think that just doing it myself is how I learned.
Do you have any advice for people that want to get into it or have started but want to get further?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I had a little bit of a tech background, but it wasn't for audio things. So I really didn't think that I could ever do it by myself. I thought that it would be something that someone has to go to school for. And it's just not that complicated. The technology that we have now, especially after the pandemic, where everyone kind of had to record from home and we had to do a lot of remote things. The technology has been so advanced and it has, just gotten so great over the past year that we barely have to even leave our house to make everything sound perfect. So just don't be scared.
What type of audio equipment do you have? How much did your setup cost?
So when I first started, you could either get a Zoom or a soundboard, and that was kind of where people were. And when I say Zoom, I don't mean Zoom as far as the meeting app. Zoom, before this, Zoom was just a recorder. And so what I did was I got a soundboard. That was my first equipment purchase. I got a soundboard and I bought 4 just dynamic mics. They cost about $20 each. The soundboard was about $100 or $150. And, some headphones. I got a headphone amp and I plugged it all together. And that's what I used to record at first because we were recording at my house in my studio. And then as we went along, I realized, we don't actually need headphones. That's actually not necessary to have headphones in this setup. So we stopped using the headphones and I would just monitor the recording as far as the volume and the levels and stuff on GarageBand as we were recording. So I was recording straight into my computer, and I have a MacBook Pro. And I was recording into GarageBand. If you don't have a MacBook Pro, you could record right into your computer. If you have anything else on Audacity, or there's a few different programs that people use. So I was doing that. And then I decided that I was going to buy a Zoom recorder as things went a little bit further so that I could record anywhere. And I didn't just have to record in the studio. I didn't need my computer, and you could record right into a Zoom recorder. I had a Zoom H6 and you record right onto just an SD card. And then you put it into your computer and the files are there. And it's more simple than you think it is. I think that everything sounds really scary. And the greatest part about what we do now is that you can look anything up on YouTube. And in about 10 minutes, you can perfect the skill of recording on any kind of platform. It's very simple. So as things went along and progressed, and I started recording from home, and my podcast partner, Noelle, so I gave her my Zoom. And what she does is she records from her computer. She hooks up her Zoom to her computer as a microphone, because you could also do that. And then I bought a Shure microphone, which normally a good Shure microphone is around $400. And now with the pandemic, they made a USB version, which is around $250. You plug it right into your computer. And that's what I've been using. I've been using this $250 microphone. I plug it right into the computer. I use my Apple headphones, and honestly, it sounds fantastic.
Yeah, you do sound, you sound totally way better than I sound right now. Ariel on Facebook asked, how important is sound quality to a podcast?
Well, I also listen to a lot of podcasts. Do you listen to a lot of podcasts, Rebecca? Yeah, we're like, so I think that when you turn a podcast on, for me at least, if it's bad sound quality, even if I really love the content, it's very hard to get through. And also if the levels are off, sometimes I listen on a speaker in my bedroom. I have like a Google Home in my bedroom. And sometimes a lot of things are very low on there if the levels aren't on. And also I listen in my car sometimes. I listen right from my phone sometimes. So I think that the sound quality is really important. And the greatest part about the pandemic was that the technology was so advanced so quickly, and everyone can, for a very small price, get fantastic sound quality. So there's no reason to skimp on sound.
So you edit all of your own podcasts?
I do. And the biggest advice that I could give anyone about editing, when I used to record with Justin, we used to edit quite a lot. We used to edit out ums and uhs and, moments of silence. And we used to, edit pieces in, and we would say, okay, we're going to take that out. And the thing that makes my podcast so much easier and so much more streamlined to put out is that me and my co-host, we try to not edit anything. We really do. We try very hard to just speak clearly, speak slowly, get our point across. And the less editing we have to do, the better. So the main editing that I do on every episode of my podcast is that I drop in the intro song. And I just make sure that all the levels are, even.
Do you have any kind of what's your background in or do you have a background in speaking or that kind of thing?
No, the only background that I have in speaking, I did theater for years before I did comedy. And then after that, I did comedy, and stand-up comedy is really where you get used to speaking to crowds. But podcasting does have a different skill set than stand-up comedy. And, when you're first doing podcasts, I think that I was very nervous first doing podcasts. I didn't know, how to speak properly, or I didn't know if I sounded okay. And I think that that's something that's always in someone's head, like, do I sound okay? But as you do it more and more, it gets just easier. It's like any other skill.
That's great. And that is a good tip for people. I think that some people are willing to listen to a certain amount of ums.
Yeah, I think that the natural way that we speak is fine. I try to mind myself, but at the same time, if you don't, you don't. And sometimes there's a pause in speech, and that's just how it goes. A lot of people are perfectionists, and I understand that. I just think that it's not necessary as long as there's a flow of the conversation.
Yeah. This is another question from Facebook. Joshua Simon asked, he cringes whenever he has to listen to himself. Do you have any advice for getting over that or making that easier?
That is so real. That is so real. I think that we deal with that a lot in stand-up comedy. If you tape your sets and you have to listen to them, when we first hear ourselves, it is terrifying. It makes me feel sick because you don't understand, that's how people hear you. But we actually, the way that sound works is that we hear our own voice differently than other people hear it, because we're kind of in our own heads when we're listening to ourselves. And then when you hear it projected out from the computer, it's very different. I think that the more you listen to yourself, the less you care. And also when you have good feedback on your podcast and you see that no one else thinks you have a weird voice, you don't have a weird voice. No one has a weird voice. Very few people have a voice that anyone would comment on. And I think that we have to remember that. Like, a lot of people think that they sound bad or they sound too masculine or too feminine. No one's listening to that. The content of your podcast, the sound quality, those are the important things.
Do you have any advice on how to like find an audience or find like a good niche for like a new podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that social media is so important now. And we're very, very blessed that we have social media because we do not have to pay for advertising. And we also have a way to reach our audience. So I think that the most important thing when you start a podcast is to think about who your audience is. And that's anything in marketing. Your first goal is to find your audience and to find your target market. For me, I think it was fairly easy. So I do a podcast about Teen Mom on MTV. Also, I do one about Catfish on MTV. And we also do one on 90 Day Fiance on TLC, which they're 3 reality shows. So our crowd is anyone who watches Teen Mom, 90 Day Fiance, or Catfish, anyone who likes reality TV, anyone who's a fan of MTV shows, anyone who's a fan of TLC shows. And a great way to reach those people for me was to join Facebook groups that had discussions about these shows and to just kind of either message the person that runs the group, the administrator, and saying like, hey, can I post about my podcast in here? Is that cool? Or even just working it into conversation when you're commenting on things, say like, oh yeah, I actually just talked about that point exactly on my podcast. And then people will say like, oh, cool. What's your podcast? And then you could kind of go from there. That is a very specific thing that we did just because we know exactly who our audience is going to be. At the same time, it's looking on Instagram and seeing where are your fans? Where are these people that are going to be listening? And for my podcast, we don't need everyone to listen to us. Rebecca, if you don't watch these shows, I don't want you to listen to my podcast. You wouldn't be interested in my podcast. So it also like kind of takes the pressure off of me trying to recruit every single person to listen to my podcast. But if you do have a general podcast, that is what you have to do. You have to put that front and forward on social media and also in your life. Literally, you have to tell every single person about it. Something that was really helpful on Instagram for us is to comment on other accounts that talk about the gossip from these shows with our account from the actual podcast. And then people would see like, oh, wow, Teen Mom Trash Talk just commented on, this article about teen moms in People magazine. And then people will follow you from there. And also just producing really good content on social media platforms.
How much time would you say, like, could I ask you like what the breakdown of your average week looks like?
Sure. So unfortunately, to record our podcast, we have to watch all of these shows. And not only do we have to watch them, but we have to take extensive notes on these shows. So 90 Day Fiance, if you guys don't know, is a 2-hour show every week. That's like watching the longest movie every single week and taking notes. So that takes about 4 to 5 hours to do because you're pausing, you're taking notes, you're writing, and then things get away from you. So it's about 4 or 5 hours for that. And then also Teen Mom, which is only an hour, thank God. And then also we have Catfish. So those are 3 right there. So we watch the show and we take notes. We also have a Patreon, which is a paywall, and we offer bonus episodes. So we have one bonus podcast and we call it BS. And me and my co-host, it's a free form podcast that we have. It's not about any of the shows. And we usually just talk about what happens in our week. And we just, we're very silly together. So that is something that's available. And we have to record that every week. And that's really the easiest to record because there's no preparation for that. We just kind of, write things down during the week that we think that would be interesting to talk about. And we talk about it, which is mostly, what we went grocery shopping for that week. Let's get real. But we make it really fun. We have a great time doing that. And then also when other shows are on that are spin-offs, a lot of time we'll cover it on Patreon. So 16 and Pregnant is related to Teen Mom. We cover that on Patreon. We cover another show called Unexpected on TLC. We cover that on Patreon. And these are bonuses that you get for being a paid subscriber. So it's a lot of watching TV, taking notes. And then, we try to record a few episodes in a day. So we really try to keep our schedule to recording Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and then watching the shows in between that.
I'm already in my head. I'm at like 15 hours a week right now. And you haven't even gotten to like the social media that you do yet, or like sponsorship.
Oh, well, I will tell you this, the sponsorship side of that is probably 50% of my work. So I work with different ad agencies on getting sponsors for your show. And now when I first started doing it, you would get like 1 or 2 sponsors, and it was not that much work because you always have availability because you don't have any other sponsors, and it's easy. Whatever dates they give you is fine. Now, as we go to the next level and as podcast budgets for advertising grow and grow and grow, because podcasting really is the future of advertising right now, we have so many ads that we have to manage. So I try to keep it to 3 spots per episode per week. And we have to basically schedule every single advertiser, and we have to make sure that nothing crosses over and that we have enough space for each advertiser. And it's, going back and forth with agencies and going back and forth with pricing and all of that stuff. And that is a full-time job in itself.
So roughly how many hours do you spend on that?
Probably 2 to 3 hours a day. Yeah.
Wow.
And then also, so when you run an ad on a podcast, say, BetterHelp is one of my sponsors. So say I run a BetterHelp ad. After I run that ad, I also then a few weeks later have to report on how many people listen to that episode for BetterHelp. I also have to send them exactly the timestamp of where their ad ran. And I also have to confirm that the ad ran. So that's, it's extra steps. It's not like you just do the ad and then you forget about it. It's a lot of admin work. There's a lot of Excel spreadsheets going on. It's all of the things that you thought you would never have to do with podcasting.
Do you have like an assistant or anyone that helps manage that?
I don't have an assistant. My co-host recently picked up the slack on the social media aspect of it. So she's been running the Instagram and the Twitter. I still run the Facebook, and we also have a discussion group for each one of our podcasts. So we have 3 podcasts and we have 3 Facebook groups that I moderate. And we ask questions. We give a password during the podcast, and we ask questions to get into the group to make sure that they're actually people that listen to our podcast and not just people that watch the shows. Because if you've ever been in a Facebook group, especially about reality TV, people will attack each other constantly.
That's like so much. Like, how active are your discussion groups?
Our discussion groups are extremely active, and I approve every single post that people post. And I also so Facebook has this new thing where you can't really curse certain words in a Facebook group. So I have an alert set that if someone writes, the word bitch, you can't say that in Facebook. And it's not for my group, it's for Facebook, and Facebook will shut down your discussion group, and they will block you from being able to participate on Facebook. They will ban your account for saying it too much, words like that. So I have this alert on. So every time someone says the B word, I have to delete the comment immediately before Facebook picks up on it. So that's what I'm doing a lot.
So can I ask, I was going to ask how podcasting feeds into stand-up. I am still curious about that, but now I'm just how do you have any time?
I have no time. I have no time at all. I think that podcasting is very helpful for stand-up though, because especially when I guest on other podcasts that are just comedy podcasts, or even, Noelle and I doing our BS podcast, we tell a lot of stories, and it's really great for writing to listen back to all of the podcasts that I was guests on, to all of our BS episodes. It really helps me write a lot of jokes because I listen back to it and I'm like, oh, that was funny. Let me write that down. You take a whole bunch of notes and then you're like, okay, these can be something, and you could write from there.
Can I also ask, you're very good at crowd work and just having conversations with audience members. Do you think, I guess it seems clear that that's related to podcasting, but do you have anything you want to say about that?
Yes. When I started comedy, I was terrified of crowd work. I was terrified to even host my own show. I had my own show in Astoria, and I would get people to host my show. I would pay them to host my show because I was so terrified of doing any kind of crowd work. I didn't think I was good at it. And then I had someone in the comedy community, a club booker, tell me that if you want to be good at comedy, you're going to have to host. If you're a good host, you can become a good comic. And I got a show in Brooklyn. It was this little restaurant show. And I was like, okay, this is the one I'm going to host. It's pretty small and I'm going to just try it out. And that's where I started doing all of the crowd work. And I was like, oh, wow, this is really fun. And then I started hosting the show that I was doing in Astoria. And I loved hosting the show that I was doing in Astoria because I was doing so much crowd work. And it became something that I'm just very comfortable with. And it makes you a little bit sharper in conversation, which is very helpful for podcasting.
So for you, the crowd work came before the podcasting?
Yeah, I guess around the same time. That's like where I started doing podcasting. And I think that I was doing better in podcasting than I was doing with crowd work. And it gave me the confidence to just, try the crowd work.
Do you have any advice for people who do you think that podcasting is good for all comedians or?
No. No, I don't. The funniest thing is that there are so many comics that are such brilliant comics and very successful comics. And then you listen to them on a podcast or you have them on your podcast and you're like, oh, this is not for everyone. Not everyone is a great podcast guest and not everyone's a great host of anything. So I think that just really finding your voice and seeing like where your lane is very important. And it doesn't mean that you're not a good comic.
Do you have any insight about what makes somebody good at podcasting or like what qualities are good for that?
It depends on what kind of podcast you're doing, I think. For the podcast that Noelle and I do, the Trash Talk podcast, it is very important to pay attention to details. That is what our fans love most. When we're talking about a show, what happened on the show if you watched it. But do you know, the color of her dress, or did you see that stain on her dress, or did you see that one thing in the background that like kind of didn't fit? And being very observant is really important for that kind of situation. Other than that, as far as like hosting a general comedy podcast, it's basically like just being someone you would want to listen to. That's really important.
Yeah. I feel like there are a lot of podcasts that are just sort of free rambling conversation without a lot of pointed whatever. How do you feel about those?
It depends on who it is and what is going on. And I think that the best podcasts that I enjoy really seem like that, but they're not. So for example, some of my favorite comics on stage, I remember before I started comedy, I used to think like, do you think they wrote these jokes or do you think they're just talking? Because I love a good conversational stand-up. And when you're on a podcast, I think that, certain people are like, okay, now we're going to talk about this topic. And yes, that does work in some formats. But when you're just doing a comedy podcast, things should flow naturally. And you should be like, wow, where did we get from here to here? One of my favorite podcasts is not on the air anymore, but I listen to back episodes constantly. It's called VADGE, VADGE, and it's hosted by Sarah Tolomash and Adrian Appalucci. And it's the two of them talking about very controversial, silly news articles and just saying things that I guess that we're all thinking and also having no filter. And they actually make me laugh so much. And you almost don't think that there is any structure, but there is a structure behind it.
Yeah, that's good. So you think like having some kind of underlying structure is good, even for
everyone has to have that. You can't just see, for example, like this podcast, you have an objective with this podcast. It's like, this is the subject. These are the questions that we're going to start for discussion. And if you don't have any of that, and especially if you're a new podcaster and you're like, oh, I'm going to have a comedy podcast, we're just going to chat. Not every one of your guests is going to be able to carry that if you can't. You need something, even if you're talking about news articles or something, you have to have some topics. Even if you don't stay on the topic, you should have something to start off with.
Yeah, I guess not everybody is as good at like back and forth conversation. That's going to end up being interesting to a person.
Yes. Even the best comics.
Yeah.
A lot of comics are not social people and they don't know how to interact. And a lot of comics are very awkward in a social interaction. When they're on stage, they're alone and they're speaking to you, but not really.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm one of those people. Sorry. But no, that's cool. Can I ask, just going back to the business side of things, sure. How long did it take you to get to the point where you felt like you were ready to reach out to sponsors?
So you actually don't reach out to sponsors. What happens is sponsors don't usually work with podcasters, specifically, just like, they don't work with they work through an agency usually. And what they do is they have big media purchases with an agency, and you're usually included in that media buy. So after you have 10,000 downloads per episode after 6 weeks, so that's after one episode has been on for 6 weeks. If it does get 10,000 downloads or more, that's when there's sponsorship opportunities. So at that point, you could reach out to an ad agency, and it's not personal. This is not like getting an agent for comedy or anything like that. It is strictly a numbers-based thing. And if they see that you have the numbers, they'll add you to their inventory, and then they start selling ads for you, and they take 30% of what it is. And a usual CPM, which is cost per 1,000 views, is around $25. That's the industry standard.
You don't have to answer this if it's too personal. How much are you making from your shows?
So me and Noelle, we're making full salaries. We're making full-time salaries and we have 3 shows across that. That comes from our Patreon, and then it also comes from ad sponsorship. But we're able to make we're able to reinvest in our podcast. So, when we need a new microphone, when, we need to pay for some artwork done, we're able to use the business money for that. And then we're also able to both live off of it. And We're looking forward to growing it, to the point where, it's bigger and bigger, and maybe we could hire a producer. But right now, we're trying to keep it small just to save resources.
That's great. Are you guys how would you make the decision about joining an affiliate group of something like Gas Digital Network? Or
I think that there's a place for that. But remember, when you join any kind of network, you're kind of, they're going to be getting the ads for you. And they're going to be telling you. So different networks have different deals. And I think that when you're fairly established, you kind of have to weigh the pros and cons and see, am I going to be making more, on a network like Gas Digital, or am I going to be making more on our own? I think that joining a network of really strong comedy podcasts, if you don't have a following for this particular podcast, is a great idea, because it's going to open up your show to the fans that they already have. And for example, Gas Digital has a great fan base. They have a very big fan base. And if you fit in with the other shows that are on that network, more than likely you would gain those followers and those fans. For, say, Teen Mom Trash Talk, if I were to join Gas Digital, the only people that would listen to that show are people that are already watching Teen Mom. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense. For us, if we were ever going to join a podcast, it would have to a podcast network. It would have to be a network that fit us, that was mainly based on reality TV, and they would have to add value to our podcast because we're already making money.
Have you ever gotten approached by something like that or some kind of deal that you had to wait?
Yeah. So we got approached by a few different networks, and a lot of the networks do not let you have a Patreon. And that is a big part of income from a podcast at sometimes. So not having a Patreon, you would have to get me so many ads, and you would have to, get me so many more listens to make it worth my while. So that's why, we always decided not to.
But yeah, that's an interesting, but I mean, it does seem like a really huge time commitment.
It is. But, a lot of people say, I want to make that kind of money doing podcasting. And people say it to me, my friends say it to me, like, why can't I make the money you're making? This is my full-time job. If you're not treating it like your full-time job, you cannot make a full-time salary. And that's how I feel about it. If you're treating it like a hobby, you're going to get paid for it like it's a hobby. And it's the same thing with stand-up comedy. If you're doing one mic a month and you're never getting booked on shows, then you're not going to make any money.
Right. What like made you take like that leap of faith that you were ready to commit to it?
So I started podcasting, and, it was kind of just like a hobby or something on the side. And then when I started Teen Mom Trash Talk, and we saw that our listeners were growing every single week, and it was just like a steady incline. So we started a Patreon. And what we did was, I don't know if you're familiar with Teen Mom. I hope you aren't, but Farrah Abraham from Teen Mom, she was in a lot of news at that time. She had shot a porn. She had released, she called it her sex tape. It was a porn that she shot. All of these different things. She was said to be, selling her body overseas and all of these things. We got an interview with her dad, who supposedly negotiated her contract with Vivid Video. So that was a big, juicy interview. And we put it on Patreon, and we charged $1 for our Patreon subscription. And we got actual people paying for it. And we were like, wow, if we could do this, what if we had even more content? And then we made different levels on Patreon, and it kind of started showing us that we could make money at this.
Okay, so you had like some level of like growth or success before you committed to it full time.
Yes, I definitely did. I was working day jobs, and then a company that I was working for closed, and I started working for myself. I started doing some social media, just like, running social media pages and doing some consulting for different companies, restaurants, bars, comedians, podcasts, everything. And I had a few clients. I was working on just like a few different freelance projects. And as the podcast grew, I had to scale myself back. I couldn't take any more clients. And then, when a client would drop out, I would not take them back. And that's kind of how it just happened.
That's cool. Yeah, I was kind of thinking, like when you said like you have to like, commit to it full time, I don't know. I always see people that like, it makes me sad how much time they're committing to comedy because like, they're just not funny and you just kind of know.
Yes.
I don't know. How do you know when your podcast is like worth it?
Okay. So I think that's a really good question, actually. And it's the same with comedy. I think that once you start making a little bit of money at it, and you could figure out how to make more money at it, that's when you should really kind of like consider cutting back a day job. But no, I don't think that you should quit your job and then say, I'm going to take podcasting very seriously and I'm going to make a full-time salary. It doesn't work like that. You have to have, not every podcast is going to be successful, no matter who you are. There are tons of really funny, really successful comics that have had podcasts flop. It doesn't mean that you're funnier or less funny than anyone else. It just means that the audience wasn't there. There was something that wasn't working. This is something that like every single thing has to fall in line. for a podcast to work. There has to be an audience. There has to be a great social media presence. There has to be good content. There has to be good sound. It has to be consistent. And that's the one thing that I see all the time in podcasting is people say like, well, I have a podcast. I don't know why I'm not getting that many listeners. And then I look back and I'm like, well, you released 3 episodes. One of them was a year ago. One of them was 2 months ago. And it's like, there's no consistency. You have to commit. And even if it's a monthly podcast, it's fine, but you have to commit to that.
Going back to the, getting the guest, of that girl's father. There's a question on Facebook from Chris Hudson. How do you book guests and how does that work in general? And how often, when a guest turns you down or says that they're busy right now, do you have a policy about following up with them, or how long do you wait?
Okay. So usually, it's kind of like you have to, I do ask people that I have a relationship with usually. So it's a little bit different. I think that networking is so important in comedy, in business, in podcasts, in anything that you're doing. Building a network of people that know you is going to be way more successful than throwing it out there to someone that you don't know. I'm not saying don't do it. I think it's a great idea. You could always, you throw something to the wall and see what sticks. You could always ask. If you want to ask Chris Rock to be on your podcast, send him a message, tweet at him. There's no harm in that. But comics that you have a relationship with should be started with, or even if you know someone that knows someone, asking for an introduction or even a recommendation. That is a really important thing. A lot of times, if a podcast doesn't have a lot of ratings or reviews, it is a sign that it doesn't have a lot of listeners. And it's a sign that it might not be worth your time to do the podcast. So that's something that you really should work on. Ask everyone that you know to leave a 5-star rating and a great review for your podcast. The more the more that you see that, the bigger listenership it has, and the more likely someone's going to say yes to a podcast. And the other thing is, when you book a guest, don't leave it up to them to pick a time in a day. I would give them a specific time and a specific day and say, hey, are you available on Monday at 1:00, this day to do this podcast? And if you're not, is there another day that works better? Because I could be flexible with you, but always give something to start out at instead of saying well, when do you want to do it?
Yeah, that's a good piece of advice, not just for podcasting, but
for life.
Yeah, for sure. Also, everybody take a minute and go give every one of Tracey's podcasts a 5-star review.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, that'd be amazing. But no, it does. When people ask me to do their podcast, a lot of times if I'm very, very busy, I kind of have to make a choice. And if someone says, no, that's fine. It doesn't necessarily mean they don't like you. It doesn't mean that they don't want to do your podcast. It could mean that they're traveling, they're on the road. It could mean they just don't have time right now.
Yeah, I will say I have very little following right now. So last year I was kind of oh, I'll say yes to literally any podcast that asks me. But then after doing 5 or 6 podcasts, I was oh, wait a minute, maybe I don't just want to do literally any podcast.
Yeah.
Because
it does depend on the time that you have. And it depends on, even the smallest podcast, you can get followers from it.
Right. But it's just I feel especially with comedy podcasts, it gets so repetitive.
It does.
It's I'm a journalism major and I studied interviewing people. It takes some amount of skill to do an original interview.
It does. There are so many people that have asked me to be on their podcast because they've heard me on another podcast and they just want me to retell the stories I told on the other podcast.
Yeah, that gets so boring for everybody.
Very boring. I'm oh God, can't you just listen to the other podcast and play my audio? And I'm all right, so what happened was I have OCD and it's oh God.
Yeah. Also, if anybody is interested in getting better at this, I really recommend a book called The Art of the Interview. I don't remember the author, but the photograph has cassette tapes on it. I mean, sorry, the photograph on the cover has cassette tapes in it.
Nice. Yeah. Interviewing is very important. Not being boring is very important during an interview. And not asking exactly the same questions that you've always heard. Something that I do ask when I interview sometimes is, tell us something that you have never spoke about on a podcast before.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really good. But I guess if your guest does do like a ton of podcasts, maybe they have nothing.
Listen, but another thing is to listen to the other podcasts that a guest has done and see what you don't want them to repeat. Because I don't want a repeating story. If I'm a fan of someone, then I've listened to all the other podcasts that they've done as well. So I don't need to hear it again.
Right. And read stuff that they've written.
Yes.
Read their social media. Also, I think like follow-up questions are important.
Yeah.
Just like, I don't know, not just going straight down a list of questions, but sort of paying attention to what's been said and like digging deeper.
Yeah, I think that questions for me and in comedy, I think that questions should be a guideline and they shouldn't be a list. It should be a guideline where, you know, if I ask you this question, maybe it triggers a conversation, go with the conversation until it doesn't go anymore and then move on. Don't be like, all right, well, next question. You know, if something's going in a good direction, then go with it. And
giving like pausing long enough for people to like finish saying what they were.
Don't interrupt the guest. No one cares about what you have to say as an interviewer. They want to listen to the guest, especially if you're interviewing, you know, and hopefully, you know, the whole goal is to be, you know, working with people that are on a much higher level than us. People want to hear your guest. They want to hear what they have to say. Although there are certain times where a guest is not really having the conversation flow, and then it's okay to pick it up there. But if someone is on a roll, I mean, let them go.
Yeah, definitely. And so, I mean, I guess just like circling back to like crowd, like how that ties into crowd work and stand up. I don't know. What would you say are the biggest things that you've gotten out of podcasting for stand up? Like, have you gotten more opportunities from it? Have you?
Yeah, I think that I've definitely gotten more opportunities. I've gotten more of a fan base. My listeners will come out to see me do stand up comedy, which makes me more valuable as a comedian. You know, so that is something that also networking. You know, I've worked with people in a podcast setting that I might not have worked with in a stand-up setting. And now they know who I am. I know who they are. And now we have a communication.
Yeah, I think when I had you on my Zoom show, like one time this a woman came to watch and she was like, oh, I like love your podcast. And I saw you in Edinburgh.
Right. Yeah. It's amazing. It's like you don't even realize. And that's why I say like you can get a following from anything that you do, even if it's small, just because when people are around, you know, you could do a Zoom show with 10 people and 2 of those people ends up being really big fans of yours. So I think that there isn't an opportunity that's too small, but you do have to manage your time.
Do you have advice? I mean, not that like, I mean, if people are in a position where they're deciding like what podcasts to like turn down, or like, how do you normally look at it? I mean, you said a little bit, but do you have any other?
Well, I mean, I think that if it's a friend of yours or someone that you work with, someone that you know, and it's not a very big podcast and you have a big following, wouldn't you want to help them? You know, I think that there's been so many people that have done that for me. And I always try to help people. I don't have a lot, but I try, you know, to give whatever I have, whatever knowledge. And even with podcasting, you know, I always tell people like, reach out to me. I'll give you, you know, advice. And people say like, oh, well, let me buy you dinner. I'm like, no, you don't have to buy me dinner. I only got where I am because people shared their information with me. You know, Ralph Sutton from Gas Digital helped me so much when I was first starting, just with audio. I mean, I constantly had an audio question for him. I constantly had like some kind of technical question for him, and he took the time to help me. So why wouldn't I take the time to help someone else?
And there are also a lot of resources online.
There are tons of them, sure. But, you know, there's some times where you're just like, I don't understand even what question to Google on this. And that's where, just ask people. And especially now, so many people are podcasting that if we're not sharing knowledge, like I don't know what we are doing. In comedy, everything is very secret. No one wants to tell anyone who books anything. And that's just not how it works.
Yeah. No, that's great advice. I think, asking people for help is probably just good general like life advice.
Yeah. I think like I said, in comedy, in stand up, in podcasting, in anything that you're doing, you're helping someone else. And you know what? Maybe they need to help you one time. And you need to reach out to them for some help. You never really know. It is just always good to be kind to people because, I always use this as an example. If I recommend someone for something or if I give you some knowledge of something, it's not like they're never going to book me and they're only like if you and I were exchanging information and, it's not like the role of a lifetime is happening and it's only between Tracey and Rebecca. And you're going to get it because I gave you information. Like, that's not how it is. There's room for everyone that is talented.
Yeah, I know. Do you listen to the Call My Girlfriend?
I don't.
Podcast. Oh, I don't. They have like, they talk about like shine theory, or it's what they call like the theory that like your friends, like friends helping each other pulls everybody up.
It does. It does. It makes like, you see in comedy too, you see like these power groups and you're like, oh, these 4 people always have each other's back and they always work together and they always recommend. Yes, that is how it should be. I'm not saying be nice to people or help people that haven't been helpful to you or have not, have been nasty to you. But at the same time, like help people. There's no reason not to, I always offer, my friends when they start a podcast, I'm like, anything you need to know, if I know it, I will tell you. Anything. A lot of people think that it's a secret on how to get ads too. No one would tell me how to get ads. And I was like, no, like I need to figure out how to get ads. And I just started Googling and I was like, oh, ad agencies. Of course, I used to work in digital media. Why didn't I know that? I didn't know it worked the same way for podcasting. It is not a secret. If you have 10,000 views after 6 weeks on your episodes, I'll recommend you to my ad people. Who cares? It's not about, there's enough ads for everyone. There are so many ads that we actually started the 3rd podcast, Catfish, a few weeks ago because we needed more inventory. Right now, podcasting advertising is at an all-time high and it's only getting bigger.
That's great. I mean, I think you're also very good at podcasting, but
I appreciate that.
But yeah, no, it's great that you found so much success in that.
My co-host is my best friend. She's not a comedian. She's not a performer. We just always had a very good rapport. And I think that that's really important too, is to, if you're going to co-host with someone, let it be someone that you genuinely like and not someone who agrees to co-host your podcast with you, because it's so important to have chemistry. She was very afraid to do a podcast. She had never spoken into a microphone before. There was nothing in her life that made her do that. And she hated the sound of her own voice. And now she is so fantastic at it that when I do a comedy podcast, I usually recommend that they book her too, because she has the same following as me. And she's a fantastic podcaster. And I've even taught her the tech portion of it for, to an extent. And she's over here, doing her thing.
That's great. And I guess it's also probably good to work with somebody that you get along with for like business reasons.
Yes. It's very important, but it really is, if 2 people don't have chemistry, it's very hard to listen to them.
And it's probably more fun also for yourself to just spend time with people that you like enjoy being around.
Yes, it's very important. Because I see so many comics and I'm like, they're co-hosting together. Do they even know each other like that? And, and then obviously, things don't work out at some point, but, you got to keep on going. You have to be consistent with things. A lot of podcasts do fail and that's okay. And you have to know when to jump ship. You can't be doing a podcast for 4 years, never growing your fan base. I mean, you can if that's what you want to do, but not to make money.
Yeah, I've also heard a lot of like kind of horror stories about people like getting into huge fights with their podcast co-hosts.
Yeah, I think that even if I got in a huge fight with Noelle, she has no choice because she's stuck with me. We've been friends for, 25 years. So
Do you have any kind of business agreement with her about?
So the podcast is mine, and I actually pay her as my employee. And, you know, she picks up some tasks, and that's how it goes. It's easier like that. It is easier than having an actual business partnership.
Yeah. Is that something you like entered? Like, did you have the legal stuff fixed before you started it?
I think that we didn't really think we'd ever make money at this. So when we did start making money, everything was in my name. I was doing all the work for that. And that's how it kind of ended up.
Okay. So it just sort of like naturally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could see how like that could definitely get disastrous depending on who you were doing it with and what your relationship is.
It definitely does. It gets very, very awkward. I mean, you know, I've been in situations before where things have gotten very awkward, or, you know, or you're working with someone for a long time and no money is being made. And you're like, at what point can I say like, hey, I think I quit? Like, no offense, but like, I can't do this anymore, you know, things like that.
Yeah, you don't want to feel like you're abandoning a friend, but
exactly. But there is a point where you do have to call it quits. And you know what? Maybe that didn't hit and maybe something else will hit. I think that being very specific on a podcast as far as the subject matter is much easier to market, even though it is very hard to do.
Sorry, I think that's probably a good note to wrap things up. Is there anything else you want to add before we...
No, I mean, just if you guys could follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Trixie Tuzini, TrixieTuzini. And you can check out all of my podcasts there. Teen Mom Trash Talk, 90 Day Fiance Trash Talk, Catfish Trash Talk, available everywhere you listen to podcasts. And if you want to see me do stand up, go to TraceyCarnazzo.com for my upcoming tour dates.
Awesome. And please leave a 5-star review on every
5-star review and a great rating.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for listening. This is Comedy Mentor Podcast. Please subscribe to it, I guess. I don't know.
Leave a 5-star rating and a great review.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. Bye. Thank you so much for.
Thank you.